If you cannot decide between the TCL QM8 or the Hisense U8K, this video is for you. We put the TCL QM8 and Hisense U8K to task in the most common use cases to see which one is best for you because there is no clear winner. We compare brightness, streaming quality, including Dolby Vision, and low bit rate content for those days where you have a bad internet connection or a sus cable box. We compare their image processing of low bitrate content against my benchmark TV processor, the LG G3, to see what is it you're missing where you're not getting a flagship image processor. So stop the FOMO and let's decide between the TCL QM8 and the Hisense U8K. But first, let me introduce today's sponsor, HooKeys. Yep, you just finished your big old PC Windows build, you have the best of the best, and sadly, you have less than $20 to your name. HooKeys to the rescue. Use my code SF20 and immediate discount. Let's quickly go through the activation process after you've purchased Windows 10 on HooKeys. Go to your HooKeys account and select My Purchased Orders. See your order. To the far right, click on the button that says View Keys Codes to see the Windows CD code. At the bottom of this order where it says Code Card, to the right is the product key you need to activate Windows. So copy this long number, then go to the Windows menu and click on Settings. In the Settings menu at the bottom, select Update and Security. Select Activation, then select Change Product Key, paste what you copied from HooKeys, click Next, click Activate, and you're done. You can download the Windows 10 Pro key and you're up and running. But that's not all, folks. HooKeys has keys for games too. Steam, Origin, Uplay, you name it, you got it. Check out their sites. There are discounts for all sorts of stuff. And most importantly, you want to be productive? What about Office Suite? Yep, you can download a copy of Office Professional with my code SF20 at checkout and bam. Let's jump right into it. We are going to begin with brightness and specifically HDR brightness. Now for some context, I'll be using content graded at 10,000 nits, 2,000 nits, and 1,000 nit, and of course Dolby Vision at 10,000 nits. But the context is this. The HDR content graded at 2,000 nits and 10,000 nits, very rare, maybe less than a handful of movies on Blu-ray disc will come graded at this level of brightness. This is to see how well these TVs can be pushed and tone map that extra brightness down to what it's capable of, right? What is it doing? Is it clipping maximum brightness? Is it aggressively pulling down the dimness? What is it doing with super bright content that you normally don't see? But just in case, it is out there, and one day you have this bright level of HDR content, you'll have an idea of what either the U8K or the TCL QM8 will do. Most content will be graded at 1,000 nits or less. Think of it as a high-performance car that could handle the track at 160 miles an hour and a car that could handle it maybe at 80 miles an hour. Both will be identical at 80, but as you push the performance level, this car will do better at higher speeds, more aggressive driving. But how often does this happen? If most of the time you're in the neighborhood driving around at 75 miles per hour or less, they're going to be very similar. And that's the context I wanted you to know is at 1,000 nits or less, which is most streaming content and movies, they'll be very similar. But as we push the content brighter and brighter, they separate themselves. And this may not be important to you if you watch mostly cable content or streaming off of a Fire Stick or a Roku stick, but I just wanted to push these TVs, so keep that in mind. And also, you'll notice I'm using the LG G3 as a benchmark comparison for accuracy of tone mapping brightness, because the G3 accurately tracks how bright the source is, meaning if the QM8 or the U8K appears to be slightly brighter, that means this is a little bit brighter than accurate. Doesn't mean it's unpleasant, it's just not quite as accurate as the G3. But as you get more and more higher grades of HDR, let's say 10,000 nits or 2,000 nits, then it may be a little bit all over the place. At the end of the day, which one is most pleasant to you is the most important question. With that out of the way, let's jump into our first HDR brightness comparison using the Spears & Munsell Benchmark UHD disc. And yes, as of July 5th, 2023, all firmware was updated to the most recent version, including the U8K, which just received an update today. As for the settings, all three TVs were set to their most accurate HDR movie modes: LG G3 in filmmaker mode, dynamic tone mapping off, all enhancements off, U8K in filmmaker mode, dynamic tone mapping on, and the QM8 in movie mode, dynamic tone mapping off. Beginning with this scene at 1000 nits, all three TVs are tone mapping pretty well, with U8K possibly having a bit more detail in the grass, more blades of grass that's visible than the QM8 using the G3 as the benchmark, and the U8K comes closest to the QM8. But what happens if we increase the brightness from HDR 1000 to 2000 nits? And you see it here in that brightest part of the cloud. There is more detail in the QM8 and the G3, whereas on the U8K, yes, it's bright, but now you've lost some of that detail at this higher grade of brightness. Dropping that brightness down to 1000 again, what happens? You see the U8K recovering all that detail, arguably slightly better contrast than the QM8, very close to the G3. And what about 10,000 nit Dolby Vision in this scene? All look pretty much the same. The QM8 slightly brighter because it can get brighter, but all the detail is there for all three TVs. This is a great scene to compare tone mapping excellence. At 10,000 nit, both the U8K and G3 struggle to fit all that color and brightness in the sun, with the QM8 doing the best here. At 2000 nits, the QM8 and G3 are similar, with the U8K still struggling to preserve color luminance in the sun. But at 1000 nits, both the QM8 and U8K are slightly over-tracking EOTF, a little bit brighter than they should be. The G3 accurately tracks it, so it's a touch darker. But at 10,000 nit Dolby Vision, the QM8 accurately tracks the EOTF brightness curve as well with the G3, while the U8K is a touch lifted, a bit too bright. So how do these differences translate to HDR movies? What you saw with the Hisense U8K struggling a little bit at 2000 and 10,000 nit content on the Spears and Munsell benchmark disc, in real movies that are graded to around 1000 nits, or maybe slightly brighter movies like Mad Max or Pan, how does the U8K compare to the TCL QM8? Let's check it out. The Greatest Showman has scenes I love using to compare HDR differences. In this scene, we have bright highlights, black levels, rich colors, and everything in between. The G3 is a good HDR benchmark for this scene, and at first glance, they all look very similar. Raising the ISO, however, you'll notice the QM8 is a touch brighter than it needs to be, whereas the U8K more closely matches the G3 in terms of luminance accuracy in those specular highlights. But in this next scene, the QM8 comes back with better contrast and black levels that more closely matches the LG G3. Turning up the exposure, we see that the QM8 has even deeper black bars than the U8K, but in normal lighting environments, both are very dark. It's just amazing how much blacker the QM8 can get. This next scene is all about tiny specular highlights, the most critical weakness of all LCD mini-LED TVs. Although the U8K is excellent for an LCD TV, the QM8 is a touch brighter, but still falling just short of the amazing LG G3 OLED. Next up, Mad Max, and in this fire guitar scene, unless I turn up the exposure to point out the subtle differences in contrast and color saturation, where the QM8 is again a little closer to the G3, you'd have a hard time telling the difference, even when they are side by side. But maybe I'm being a bit too nitpicky here. Where it counts, HDR impact, definitely very close in terms of brightness, with the G3 slightly ahead because of contrast and dynamic range, QM8 just behind, and the U8K oh so close. Next is pan and this super bright scene above 2000 nits. Very little separates the U8K from the QM8, with the G3 rendering both brightness, contrast, color detail. So this is why you get an OLED, but the U8K and the QM8 definitely preserves that HDR impact. And what about streaming in HDR and Dolby Vision on Netflix? The differences actually may surprise you. Check it out. TV settings are the same for streaming high-quality Netflix HDR in filmmaker mode on the U8K and the G3 in movie mode on the QM8. Some may argue that near black is a little bit crushed on the G3, and maybe it's because check out the same scene in Dolby Vision on the G3. Now the G3 has more shadow detail, making it look more similar to the QM8 and the U8K without Dolby Vision. How does the QM8 and U8K appear in Dolby Vision in this scene? The U8K is unfortunately a bit lifted in the shadows, so I don't recommend Dolby Vision on the U8K, but the QM8 is unchanged. This is impressive. It appears that the G3 may be more accurate in Dolby Vision than HDR, while the QM8 is excellent in both and the U8K is better in standard HDR than Dolby Vision. Ugh. Now you know why Samsung doesn't care for wasting time with Dolby Vision. So Dolby Vision on the TCL QM8 is most similar to the G3. In other words, it's most accurate in Dolby Vision Dark, whereas even in Dolby Vision Dark, the U8K is slightly lifted, slightly brighter than is necessary. Now in a bright room, that actually might work well for you, because in a bright room, the TCL QM8, you might want Dolby Vision Bright to bring out some of that shadow detail. But ultimately, this is what I noticed. The difference between HDR and Dolby Vision, negligible. And this is why I'm not a huge fan of Dolby Vision either way. If it's there, great. If not, it doesn't affect my viewing experience at all. And what about sports watching in a bright room? Here you see the QM8 is slightly brighter than the U8K, which is in turn slightly brighter than the G3. If you need the brightest TV you can buy this year, definitely consider the QM8, but the U8K is not that far behind. Although the QM8 is the brightest TV I have yet seen for sports, ever. I mean, brighter than the QM90A, the QM90B, brighter than U8H, the QM8 is definitely a bright sports watching TV. But this next comparison might bring it down to earth because it's also an important factor for you sports fans, and I'm talking about image processing, specifically challenging HDR scenes and low bitrate sports in motion. This scene in Monster Hunter is a real challenge for both the QM8 and G3. Check out how they are struggling with the flashing light, with the QM8 introducing artifacts while the G3 has major color banding, also known as posterization. Let me try and capture this in 120 FPS to better demonstrate the differences. I am completely surprised that the U8K runs this scene so well. I wonder how the Sony X90L with XR Clear will do in this scene. For low bitrate testing of YouTube TV and similarly bad sources, the settings are the QM8 put in sports mode, the U8K in HDR standard, and the G3 also in standard. And all TVs have their noise reduction on high. And most importantly, the G3 has smooth gradation on high, QM8 has gradation clear on high, and the U8K has smooth gradient on high. This is the most important setting for low bitrate content. What we're looking for is macro blocking and pixelation artifacts like this, but more importantly, how they appear in motion. Let's check out this tennis match between Djokovic and Kachin. Look at the moving green background. The macro blocking is much more noticeable on the QM8 than the U8K or G3. If we examine the settings, you can see how changing that gradient setting from high to off makes the macro blocking worse on all the TVs. This is why you should always have it on high when receiving low bitrate content, even if it is 4K. Let's wrap this up. Let's begin by summing up their similarities. Excellent blooming control, near OLED-like black bars, and bright HDR specular highlights. Those three things make both of these TVs excellent for most people. And if you're watching just streaming content, basic sports, and the like, well, either one might work for you. Now, let's get into the differences that matter and separates the two TVs, beginning with what the TCL QM8 does better than the U8K. One, it tone maps bright HDR scenes better. And when I say bright, I'm talking about 2000 nits or more, which means there are not a lot of movies out there that really is above 2000 nits. I mean, specifically, maybe that scene from Pan that you saw or Mad Max, but ultimately, it really does rule the roost when it comes to benchmark discs like the Spears and Munsell comparisons that we saw that had both 10,000 and 2,000 nits. QM8 did very well matching the G3, surprisingly, right? Also, it has slightly better contrast, so in a dark room, I highly recommend the QM8 because for dark room watching, you'll see the subtle contrast improvement of the QM8 over the U8K. And if you need ultimate brightness in a bright room, yes, SDR Sports, it is definitely a little bit brighter than the U8K. And of course, if Dolby Vision is important to you, its Dolby Vision is a little bit more accurate. Its Dolby Vision Dark best resembles what my G3 calibrated Dolby Vision looks like. But the U8K is no slouch. It is definitely the better TV for image processing of low bitrate content or difficult HDR scenes. As you saw, the U8K did this better even than the G3 when it came to challenging HDR content. Excellent processor, no doubt. And it has more precise calibration control. Now, we didn't go over that, but I'm just going to throw that out there. The U8K and the U7K has more points to calibrate. So if you're interested in calibrating the TV, U8K can get you closer to accuracy, whereas the QM8 was really meant to be used out of the box with minimal calibration, right? So who should get what TV? Ultimately, if you have bad internet and you love streaming, or you have a bad cable box, or you have challenging over-the-air content, you really have low bitrate issues. YouTube TV is your thing, the U8K is the one to get, because the slight improvements of the QM8 may not justify losing and getting a lot of the macro blocking, losing some of the resolution due to motion issues, right? The U8K is really good for sources where it's not always the best. On the other hand, if you have the best sources, Kaleidoscape. Well, I guess if you have Kaleidoscape, you should be getting the S95C, right? But Blu-ray discs, high bitrate content from Netflix and Prime and all the good stuff where you have a gigabit connection, you know it's a good connection. The QM8 really delivers with high quality sources. So as you can see, there is no perfect TV, but there is another TV in this price class. I'm talking about the slightly more expensive Sony X90L. How does that compare to the TCL QM8 or the Hisense U8K? Well, hang on, we have a live stream coming up comparing them to the Sony X90L. Or if you want to compare the U8K and the QM8 to slightly less expensive versions, the Q7 and the U7K, we did those side-by-side comparisons down here in an earlier live stream. Until next time, stop the FOMO.